I'm Elsa, 32, and this is the story of how my father's cruel laughter became the catalyst for me claiming what was rightfully mine. Before I go deeper into my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from, if you've ever stood your ground. When someone failed to see your worth, feel free to let me know below. And if these kinds of stories speak to you, you're welcome to follow the channel for more. Growing up in the Mitchell household meant understanding your place in an invisible hierarchy that no one ever spoke about, but everyone lived by. At the top sat my younger brother Derek, golden-haired and charming, the son who could do no wrong even when he was doing everything wrong. At the bottom was me, the daughter who learned early that achievements meant nothing if you didn't have the right anatomy. I remember being 12 years old, bringing home a report card filled with straight A's, my heart racing with the hope that this time would be different. I found Dad in his favorite recliner, newspaper spread across his lap, and I placed that report card right on top of the sports section he was reading. He glanced down, grunted something that might have been approval, and moved the paper aside without a word. 20 minutes later, Derek bounded through the door with a C- in math, and suddenly the living room filled with Dad's booming laughter and promises of ice cream to celebrate Derek's improvement. That night, lying in my narrow twin bed, while Derek got taken out for Sundays, I learned a lesson that would echo through the next 20 years of my life. It didn't matter how hard I tried, how much I achieved, or how desperately I wanted their approval. I was born the wrong gender in a family that valued sons above everything else. The pattern repeated itself countless times throughout my childhood and teenage years. When I made varsity soccer as a freshman, Dad missed every single game but never failed to attend Derek's JV basketball matches where he spent most of the time on the bench. When I got accepted to State University with a partial academic scholarship, the dinner conversation focused on whether Derek would choose baseball or football for his senior year. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance, Dad spent the celebration dinner talking about Derek's new girlfriend and how proud he was that his son was finally settling down. I became invisible in my own home, a ghost who cleaned her room, did her homework, and achieved everything that should have made parents proud, all while watching my brother get praised for the bare minimum. Derek learned that charm could substitute for effort, that being Dad's favorite meant never having to face real consequences, and that the world owed him success simply because he existed. Meanwhile, I learned to swallow disappointment like bitter medicine, to find motivation in spite rather than support, and to build my self-worth from internal reserves because external validation was never coming. I watched Derek drift through high school with mediocre grades and big dreams, always confident that Dad would bail him out, while I worked nights at a local diner to save money for college expenses my scholarship didn't cover. The most painful part wasn't even the favoritism itself. It was the gaslighting that came with it. When I finally worked up the courage at 16 to ask Dad why Derek got everything handed to him while I had to fight for scraps of attention, he looked at me with genuine confusion and said, "Elsa, you're being dramatic. We treat you kids exactly the same." That's when I realized that in his mind he actually believed it. The bias was so deeply ingrained that he couldn't even see it anymore. Mom knew, though. I could see it in the apologetic look she'd give me when Dad would go on and on about Derek's latest mediocre accomplishment. But she never said anything, never stood up for me, never challenged the dynamic that was slowly eating away at my sense of belonging in my own family. She was complicit in her silence, and somehow that hurt even more than Dad's outright favoritism. By the time I turned 18 and left for college, I had built walls around my heart that were 10 feet thick and made of pure determination. I told myself I didn't need their approval, didn't need their support, didn't need anything from them at all. But deep down, in a place I rarely let myself examine, that 12-year-old girl with the perfect report card was still standing in the living room, waiting for her father to look up from his newspaper and tell her she mattered. The saddest part was how normal it all felt. This was just how the Mitchell family worked, how it had always worked, and how everyone assumed it would always work. Derek was the heir apparent to Dad's love and attention, and I was the supporting character in my own family's story. I graduated high school with honors, got into college on merit, and started building a life completely independent of their support or approval, but that fundamental dynamic never changed. Even as I grew older and began to understand how dysfunctional our family was, part of me kept hoping that someday Dad would wake up and see what he'd done, see what he'd missed, see who I really was beneath all those years of being overlooked. That hope was dangerous because it kept me tethered to a dynamic that had never served me, but I couldn't quite let it go. I was about to learn that sometimes life has a way of forcing those reckonings whether we're ready for them or not. College became my sanctuary, the place where I could finally be valued for who I was rather than dismissed for who I wasn't. For the first time in my life, professors noticed my insights in class discussions. My work ethic earned recognition, and my achievements belonged to me alone. I threw myself into my studies with the hunger of someone who had been starving for acknowledgement her entire life. I majored in finance because numbers made sense in a way that family dynamics never had. In spreadsheets and financial models, everything added up correctly. There was no favoritism in mathematics, no golden children in accounting principles. Success was measurable, objective, and achievable through pure effort. It was everything my childhood had not been. The 4 years I spent at State University were transformative in ways I'm still discovering. I worked 20 hours a week at the II campus bookstore to cover my living expenses, maintained a 3.8 GPA, and slowly began to understand that the voice in my head telling me I wasn't good enough was not my voice at all. It was an echo of 20 years of being treated as less than. Made friends who came from families that celebrated their daughters' achievements. I watched roommates get care packages and encouraging phone calls from parents who were genuinely interested in their lives, their dreams, their struggles. It was like discovering that other people lived in a completely different world, one where love wasn't rationed based on gender and where support wasn't a zero-sum game. But even surrounded by this new reality, I found myself making excuses for my family when friends would ask why my parents never visited or why I never went home for holidays. "They're busy," I'd say, or "we're not really a close family," as if distance could explain away the fundamental lack of care I'd experienced. Part of me was still protecting them, still hoping that maybe I was the problem and they were just doing their best. After graduation, I moved to the city and started working for a mid-sized investment firm. I was hungry for success in a way that my colleagues, most of whom came from supportive families, couldn't quite understand. While they worked to build careers, I worked to build an entire identity separate from the family that had never seen my worth. I threw myself into learning everything I could about financial planning, investment strategies, and wealth management. I studied for certifications on weekends, networked at industry events, and slowly began building a reputation as someone who could turn struggling portfolios into success stories. My clients started referring their friends. My boss began giving me bigger accounts, and within 3 years, I was making more money than my father ever had. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dad had always talked about Derek's potential, about how his son was going to do great things in the world, but here I was, actually doing them, while Derek bounced from one failed venture to another. Every promotion, every successful client presentation, every bonus I earned felt like evidence in a case I was building, proof that they had been wrong about me all along. But success, I discovered, was a complicated thing when you achieved it to prove a point, rather than because it fulfilled you. Every milestone felt hollow because the people whose approval I'd originally sought were still dismissing my accomplishments. When I bought my first condo at 26, Mom's response was, "That's nice, dear. Derek's thinking about looking at apartments too." When I got promoted to senior financial advisor, Dad's comment was, "Well, I guess someone has to handle rich people's money." I realized I was caught in a trap of my own making. I had built this successful life partly to show them they were wrong about me, but their continued indifference meant that no amount of success would ever feel like enough. I was still that 12-year-old girl with the perfect report card, just with a bigger bank account and a business suit. The worst part was how lonely success felt when you had no one to share it with, who truly understood its significance. My friends celebrated with me, of course, but they couldn't understand why every achievement felt like I was climbing a mountain, only to discover the summit was still not high enough to be seen from my childhood home. By the time I turned 30, I had everything I thought I wanted: a thriving career, financial independence, a beautiful home, and the respect of my peers. But I also had a relationship with my family that consisted of stilted phone calls every few weeks and obligatory visits during major holidays, where I felt like a stranger observing someone else's life. Derek, meanwhile, continued to drift through life with Dad's unwavering support. He'd started and abandoned 3 different business ventures, each failure explained away as bad luck or poor timing rather than lack of effort or planning. Dad had co-signed loans, provided emergency funds, and consistently expressed confidence that Derek would eventually find his calling. I watched this pattern from the outside with a mixture of frustration and something that might have been pity. Derek had never learned to stand on his own because he'd never had to, and Dad had never learned to see me clearly because he'd never been forced to look. I thought this was just how our family would always be. Me succeeding despite them loving Derek despite his failures, and all of us locked in our respective roles until the end of time. I had made peace with being the forgotten daughter who built her own empire, while the golden child stumbled through life with a safety net I'd never been offered. I had no idea that life was about to hand me an opportunity to rewrite our entire family story. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March, just as I was reviewing quarterly reports for my biggest client. I almost didn't answer when I saw Mom's name on the caller ID. Our conversations had become increasingly strained over the years, filled with awkward pauses and careful avoidance of topics that might reveal how little we actually knew about each other's lives. But something made me pick up. Maybe the unusual timing since Mom rarely called during what she knew were my work hours, or maybe the sixth sense that tells you when your world is about to shift on its axis. Elsa? Her voice was different, smaller somehow, with a tremor I'd never heard before. I need to talk to you about something important. The story came out in fragments, interrupted by long pauses and what sounded like suppressed tears. Dad's construction business, which had been struggling for years, had finally collapsed completely. The medical bills from his heart attack the previous summer had wiped out most of their savings. Derek's latest business venture, some kind of online retail company that Dad had co-signed loans for, had gone bankrupt, leaving them responsible for $40,000 in debt they couldn't pay. But the worst part, the part that made Mom's voice crack completely, was that they were facing foreclosure on the house. The house where I'd grown up feeling invisible, but which still represented the only stability our family had ever known. They had 60 days to come up with 3 months of back mortgage payments plus penalties, or they would lose everything. I don't know what we're going to do, Mom whispered, and for the first time in my adult life, I heard my mother sound completely defeated. Your father won't admit how bad things are. He keeps saying Derek will figure something out. That one of his contacts will come through with an opportunity, but Elsa, there is no time left. We're going to lose the house. I sat in my pristine home office, surrounded by awards and certifications that represented years of hard work and financial expertise, listening to my mother describe a crisis that my professional skills were perfectly suited to address. The irony was almost laughable. Here they were, drowning in exactly the kind of financial problems I solved for clients every day, yet it had never occurred to either of my parents to ask for my help. How much do you need? I asked, already mentally calculating payment schedules and refinancing options. Oh, honey, I'm not calling to ask for money, Mom said quickly. I know you've worked hard for what you have, and this isn't your responsibility. I needed to tell someone who would understand how serious this is. Your father thinks I'm being dramatic, and Derek keeps promising he'll handle it. But I can see the foreclosure notice every day when I get the mail, and I know they're not being dramatic. That's when it hit me. Even in their moment of greatest crisis, even when I was literally the most qualified person they knew to help with their exact problem, it still hadn't occurred to them to see me as a resource. I was still just Elsa, the daughter who existed on the periphery of their real life, someone to confide in, but not someone to rely on. But for the first time in 32 years, I realized I held all the cards. They needed something I could provide. Something that Derek's charm and Dad's favoritism couldn't magic into existence. They needed money, financial expertise, and a clear-headed approach to crisis management. They needed exactly what I had spent my entire adult life building. Mom, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, what if I told you I could solve this problem? What if I could catch up the mortgage payments and help you refinance at a better rate? What if I could make this whole crisis disappear? The silence. On the other end stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, Mom spoke, her voice filled with a hope so fragile it broke my heart. Could you really do that? I mean, I know you do well for yourself, but this is a lot of money, and I wouldn't want you to put yourself at risk for us. For us. After 32 years of being treated like an afterthought, my mother was worried about me putting myself at risk for them. The protective instinct I felt toward her in that moment surprised me. Underneath all the years of feeling overlooked and undervalued, I still loved these imperfect people who had raised me. I can do this, Mom, I said. I want to do this. But I need to talk to Dad directly. I need him to understand what I'm offering and what it would mean. Another pause. He's very proud, Elsa. This whole situation has been hard on his ego, having to accept help, especially from... She trailed off, but I knew what she wasn't saying. Especially from the daughter he'd never taken seriously. I understand, I said, though I wasn't sure I did. But Mom, pride doesn't pay mortgages, and if he wants to save the house, he's going to have this conversation with me. After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, staring out the window at the city lights below. I had spent so many years building a life independent of my family's approval, convincing myself that I didn't need their recognition or validation. But now, faced with the opportunity to be their salvation, I realized how much I still craved the chance to prove my worth to them. This wasn't just about helping them avoid foreclosure. This was about finally being seen as valuable, as capable, as worthy of respect and gratitude. This was my chance to step out of the shadows and show them exactly who I had become while they weren't paying attention. I started making lists that night: payment schedules, refinancing options, legal considerations. I researched foreclosure, laws and redemption periods. I calculated exactly how much money it would take to not just solve their immediate crisis, but to put them on stable financial footing for years to come. But underneath all the practical planning, something else was stirring, a hope I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten it existed. The hope that this time, when I showed up with solutions and resources and the ability to save everything they cared about, my father would finally look up from his metaphorical newspaper and see me. I had no idea that hope was about to be shattered in the most painful way possible, setting in motion a chain of events that would change our family forever. I drove to my childhood home on a Saturday morning in early April, my leather portfolio filled with loan documents, refinancing options, and a detailed financial plan that could solve every problem my parents faced. I had spent the entire week preparing for this conversation, running through different scenarios, anticipating objections, and crafting what I thought would be an irresistible offer of help. The house looked smaller than I remembered and shabbier. The paint was peeling around the window frames, the front porch sagged slightly, and the lawn had the patchy, neglected look of people who had more pressing concerns than landscaping. Seeing it through adult eyes, I could understand why they were struggling to keep up with maintenance on top of mortgage payments. Mom answered the door with a nervous smile, her eyes red-rimmed from what I suspected were many sleepless nights. She hugged me tighter than usual, and I could feel the tension in her shoulders, the weight of worry she'd been carrying alone. "He's in the living room," she whispered as she led me inside. "I told him you wanted to discuss the house situation, but I didn't give him details. You know how he gets." I did know how he gets. Dad had always been a man who believed that accepting help was a sign of weakness, that real men solved their own problems, and that family discussions about money were somehow beneath his dignity. But I had convinced myself that desperation might have humbled him, that facing the loss of everything might have opened his mind to solutions he would have rejected in better times. I found him in his recliner, the same one where he'd dismissed my perfect report card 20 years earlier. He looked older, grayer, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. But his posture was still defiant, still carrying himself like a man who refused to admit that life had beaten him down. "Dad," I said, settling into the chair across from him with my portfolio balanced on my knees. "Mom told me about the situation with the house. I want to help." He glanced up from the television, his expression already guarded. "Your mother worries. Too much. Derek's got some irons in the fire, we'll figure it out." Dad, I've reviewed the numbers. You're facing foreclosure in 43 days. Even if Derek's ventures suddenly become profitable, which realistically could take months or years, you need immediate cash flow to save the house. But I can solve this problem right now, today. I opened my portfolio and spread out the documents I'd prepared: loan modification applications, refinancing options, and a personal check I'd already written for the full amount of back payments and penalties. I can bring your mortgage current immediately, I continued, my voice steady and professional. I can also help you refinance at a lower interest rate, which would reduce your monthly payments by almost $300. Additionally, I've prepared a financial plan that would help you rebuild your savings and avoid future crises. Dad stared at the papers for a long moment, and I held my breath, waiting for gratitude, relief, or at minimum, serious consideration of what I was offering. Instead, he started laughing. Not a chuckle or a brief smile, but deep, genuine laughter that filled the room and seemed to go on forever. He laughed like I had just told him the funniest joke he'd ever heard, like the idea of me helping him was so absurd it was genuinely entertaining. "Elsa," he said, wiping tears from his eyes, "that's sweet, honey, but this is serious adult business. This isn't about balancing your checkbook or helping your girlfriends figure out their credit card bills. We're talking about real money here, real problems that need real solutions." The words hit me like physical blows. After everything I'd accomplished, after years of building a successful career and managing millions of dollars for clients, he still saw me as a little girl playing dress-up in the grown-up world. "Dad, I manage over $50 million in client assets. I've helped dozens of families navigate financial crises much more complex than this one. I know exactly what kind of real money and real problems we're dealing with here, and I have both the resources and expertise to solve them." He waved his hand dismissively, the same gesture he'd used to brush aside my achievements for as long as I could remember. "Look, sweetheart, I appreciate that you want to help, I really do, but you're just a girl who got lucky in some office job. Derek understands business, understands how the real world works. He's got connections, deals in the pipeline, men who know how to handle serious money." The room went very quiet. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, could hear Mom's sharp intake of breath from the kitchen doorway where she'd been listening. But mostly, I could hear the sound of something inside me finally breaking. Just a girl who got lucky. The words echoed in my head as I looked at this man who had spent my entire life minimizing my accomplishments, dismissing my capabilities, and refusing to see who I actually was. Here he sat, facing the loss of everything he'd worked for, and he would rather trust in Derek's vague promises than accept concrete help from his daughter who actually had the means to save him. "Dad," I said, my voice quieter now but carrying a weight that made him finally look directly at me, "I am offering to write a check today for $63,000 to save your house. I am offering to use my professional expertise to restructure your finances and put you on stable ground for the first time in years. I am offering to solve every problem you're facing, and you're laughing at me." "Now don't get all emotional," he said, but something in his tone had shifted slightly. "I know you mean well, but this situation requires more than good intentions. Derek's been working on some big deals. He's got investors interested in his new concept. Real business, not just pushing papers around in some office." That's when I understood with crystalline clarity that this had never been about the money or the house or the foreclosure. This was about something much deeper, something that ran to the very core of who my father was and how he saw the world. In his mind, I would always be less capable than Derek, less valuable, less worthy of respect, regardless of what I achieved or how badly Derek failed. I could have written a check for $1 million, and he still would have preferred to wait for Derek's next scheme. I could have shown up with a team of financial advisors and a foolproof plan, and he still would have dismissed it as just a girl playing with numbers. Nothing I ever did would be enough to change how he saw me, because the problem wasn't my capabilities. It was his inability to see daughters as anything other than supporting characters in his son's stories. I closed my portfolio and stood up, feeling strangely calm for the first time in weeks. The little girl who had spent 32 years hoping for his approval finally stopped hoping. In her place stood a woman who knew exactly what she was worth, and exactly what she was going to do about it. "You're right, Dad," I said, my voice steady as stone. "This does require more than good intentions. It requires someone who understands both real money and real consequences. Enjoy waiting for Derek's big deals." I walked toward the door, ignoring Mom's pleading look and Dad's confused expression. He had made his choice, just as he'd been making the same choice my entire life. Now it was time for me to make mine. I sat in my car outside my childhood home for 20 minutes after that conversation, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The hurt and anger warred inside me, but underneath both emotions was something I hadn't expected. Clarity. For the first time in my life, I saw the situation exactly as it was, without the filter of hope or the distortion of wishful thinking. My father would rather lose everything than accept help from me. He would rather trust in Derek's empty promises than acknowledge my proven capabilities. And that told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in this family and where I would always stand no matter what I achieved. But as I drove home that day, something else began crystallizing in my mind. A plan that was part business strategy and part poetic justice, rooted in the financial expertise Dad had dismissed and the resources he'd refused to take seriously. I had offered to save their house by bringing the mortgage current and helping them refinance. Dad had laughed at that offer, preferring to wait for Derek's mythical big break. But there was another option, one I hadn't mentioned because I'd assumed they would want to maintain ownership of their family home. I could buy the house myself. The idea was so simple, so elegant, that I wondered why it hadn't occurred to me immediately. Foreclosure auctions were public sales where anyone could bid. If Mom and Dad couldn't or wouldn't accept my help to save their house through conventional means, nothing was stopping me from purchasing it myself when it went to auction. That evening, I called my attorney, Janet Morrison, a sharp woman in her 50s who had handled several real estate transactions for me over the years. I explained the situation in clinical terms, focusing on the business aspects rather than the family drama. "So you want to buy your parents' house at foreclosure auction," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "That's certainly legal, Elsa, but are you prepared for the family implications? This could create some significant relationship complications." I almost laughed at the understatement. "Janet, my relationship with my family has been complicated for 32 years. At least this way. The complications will be on my terms." We spent an hour discussing the logistics. I would need to research the property value, determine a bidding strategy, arrange financing, and prepare for the legal requirements of the auction process. Janet would handle the paperwork and ensure everything was properly documented. "One thing to consider," she said as we wrapped up. "If you purchase the property, you'll become their landlord. You'll need to decide whether you want them to remain as tenants, and if so, under what terms. That conversation could be challenging." Over the next 3 weeks, I threw myself into research with the same intensity I brought to my most complex client cases. I ordered professional appraisals, researched comparable sales in the neighborhood, and studied every detail of the foreclosure process. I obtained pre-approval for financing, though I had enough liquid assets to purchase the property outright if necessary. The house was worth approximately $180,000 in current market conditions, though it needed significant updates and repairs. The outstanding mortgage balance was $147,000, plus back payments and penalties, bringing the total to around $165,000. I set my bidding limit at $190,000, which would be enough to outbid most investors while still representing a reasonable purchase price. During this time, I had no contact with my family. Mom called twice, but I let the calls go to voicemail. Her messages were increasingly frantic, asking if I was still willing to help, saying that Dad was finally ready to have a serious conversation about accepting assistance. But I had moved beyond that conversation. Dad had made his choice when he laughed at my offer, and now I was making mine. The most difficult part of this process wasn't the financial planning or legal preparation. It was examining my own motivations. Was I buying the house to help my family or to hurt them? Was this an act of love or revenge? The answer, I realized, was that it was both. And maybe that was okay. I was hurt and angry, yes. But I was also still the daughter who didn't want to see her parents homeless. Buying the house would prevent them from losing their home. even if they ended up as tenants rather than owners. It would also force a fundamental shift in our family dynamic, putting me in a position of power that Dad had always denied me. 2 weeks before the auction, Derek called me for the first time in months. His voice had the strained cheerfulness of someone delivering bad news while pretending it was good news. "Hey, Becca," he said, using the childhood nickname that had always annoyed me. "Mom told me about your generous offer to help with the house situation. That's really sweet of you, but you don't need to worry about it anymore. I've got a deal coming through that's going to solve everything." "What kind of deal?" I asked, genuinely curious about what fantasy he was spinning this time. "It's complicated, but basically I'm partnering with some investors on a new app concept. We're looking at a potential buyout that could be worth serious money. I should have the funds to catch up the mortgage within the next month or two." A month or two. The auction was in 12 days. "Derek," I said, "do you understand that the foreclosure auction is scheduled for next Friday? There's no extension, no grace period, no waiting for deals that might come through eventually. Either someone pays the amount owed by auction day, or the house gets sold to whoever shows up with the highest bid." I know, he said, irritation creeping into his voice. "But these things can be postponed, can't they? I mean, if we're actively working on a solution." That's when I realized that Derek, despite being Dad's chosen heir and supposedly understanding how the real world works, had no clue how foreclosure actually worked. He genuinely believed that good intentions and pending deals could somehow pause legal proceedings. "No, Derek," I said. "These things cannot be postponed. The auction happens on schedule whether you're ready or not." After I hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity for my brother. He had spent his entire life believing that his charm and Dad's confidence in him would somehow translate into actual success, but he had never learned to deal with hard deadlines and real consequences. Dad's favoritism had done him no favors in preparing him for a world that didn't care about his potential. But my pity didn't change my plan. I had offered them a real solution, and they had chosen to reject it in favor of false hope and empty promises. Now they would live with the consequences of that choice, and I would live with mine. The auction was set for 10 a.m. on a Friday morning. I would be there with my cashier's check and my attorney, ready to purchase my childhood home and fundamentally alter my family's future. Whether that alteration was salvation or catastrophe would depend entirely on how they chose to handle what came next. The county courthouse steps were busier than I had expected on that Friday morning in May. Real estate investors clustered in small groups, comparing notes and discussing strategy. A few families stood apart from the business crowd, their faces marked by the particular strain of people about to lose their homes. And then there was me, standing with Janet in my best professional attire, feeling like I was about to step into an alternate reality where everything I thought I knew about my life was about to change. I spotted my parents' car in the parking lot, but didn't see them in the crowd. Part of me hoped they had decided not to witness this, but another part knew that Dad's pride wouldn't let him miss the chance to see who was about to become his new landlord. He probably still believed Derek would appear at the last minute with a briefcase full of investor money, like something out of a movie. The auctioneer, a weathered man in his 60s who clearly did this for a living, began calling out the properties scheduled for sale that day. There were 7 foreclosures on the docket, and my parents' house was 4th on the list. I watched the first 3 auctions with professional interest, noting bidding patterns and investor behavior, while trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. When they called 14 Maple Street Mitchell property, I felt every nerve in my body come alive. This was it. No more planning, no more strategizing, no more wondering what would happen. The next 10 minutes would determine whether I became a homeowner or whether some stranger would become my parents' new landlord. The auctioneer started the bidding at $120,000, well below the property's actual value but standard for foreclosure auctions. 2 investors immediately jumped in, and the price climbed quickly to $150,000. I waited, letting them establish the baseline while I scanned the crowd for my parents. I found them standing at the edge of the group, Mom clutching Dad's arm with white knuckles, both of them looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen them. Dad's face was set in hard lines, his jaw clenched with the effort of maintaining dignity in an undignified situation. Mom kept glancing around anxiously, probably still hoping Derek would appear with a last-minute miracle. At $160,000, one of the investors dropped out. At $165,000, the bidding slowed as we approached the actual debt amount. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the point where serious buyers separated from casual speculators. $170,000, I called out, my voice steady and clear. Every head in the crowd turned toward me. The auctioneer nodded in my direction, and I saw the moment of recognition flash across several faces. Word traveled quickly in small crowds, and within seconds, everyone knew that this wasn't just another investor. This was the daughter bidding on her own family's home. The remaining investor, a man in his 40s wearing a rumpled suit, glanced at me with calculation in his eyes. He'd probably done this dozens of times, bought distressed properties from desperate families, but something about my presence seemed to give him pause. $175,000, he called, but his voice lacked conviction. I looked directly at him when I responded. $185,000. The message was clear. I wasn't going to be outbid by a few $1,000s. This wasn't just business for me, and I had both the resources and motivation to go as high as necessary. He studied my face for a moment, then shook his head and stepped back. He was out. Any other bids? The auctioneer called. $185,000 going. Once. That's when I made the mistake of looking directly at my parents. Mom had tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of relief. They were tears of shock, confusion, and something that looked like betrayal. Dad's expression was harder to read. Anger, certainly, but also something that might have been recognition. For the first time in my life, he was looking at me like I was someone to be reckoned with. $185,000 going twice. I had seconds to change my mind, to withdraw my bid and let the property go to someone else. For a moment, I wavered. This was my family, after all. These were the people who had raised me, fed me, housed me for 18 years. Was I really about to become their landlord? Was I really going to fundamentally alter our family dynamic in such a dramatic, irreversible way? But then I remembered Dad's laughter echoing through the living room 3 weeks ago. I remembered 32 years of being dismissed, overlooked, and undervalued. I remembered my perfect report card being pushed aside for Derek's mediocre efforts. I remembered being told I was just a girl who got lucky when I offered to save everything they cared about. Sold to bidder 47 for $185,000. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to split the morning air. In that instant, I became the owner of 14 Maple Street, the house where I'd grown up feeling invisible, the house my father had just lost because he couldn't accept help from his daughter. Janet was immediately at my side, handling the paperwork and payment procedures with professional efficiency. I signed documents, wrote checks, and completed the legal transfer of ownership, all while maintaining a calm exterior that belied the emotional storm raging inside me. The crowd began to disperse as the auction moved on to the next property, but my parents remained frozen in place, staring at me with expressions I'd never seen before. For the first time in my life, they looked at me with something approaching awe, though whether it was positive or negative remained to be seen. I walked over to them slowly, Janet trailing behind with the deed and legal documents. Mom started to speak twice, then stopped, apparently unable to find words for what had just happened. Dad remained silent, his face cycling through emotions too quickly for me to track. Elsa, Mom finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. What does this mean? What happens now? I looked at these two people who had shaped so much of my early life, who had given me both the foundation to succeed and the motivation to prove myself. Standing there holding the deed to their house, I felt powerful in a way I'd never experienced before, but also strangely empty. It means you don't have to worry about foreclosure anymore, I said. It means the house stays in the family. But we're not the family that owns it anymore, are we? Dad spoke for the first time, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't identify. No, I said simply. You're not. The three of us stood there in the courthouse parking lot, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. Everything had changed in the space of 10 minutes, and none of us were quite sure what came next. I need some time to process this, I said finally. Janet will be in touch about the legal details and next steps. For now, nothing changes. You can stay in the house while we figure out the arrangements. I started to walk away, then turned back one more time. Dad, 3 weeks ago I offered to solve this problem while leaving you in control of your home. You laughed at that offer. This is what it looks like when someone with just luck and an office job actually solves the problem. As I drove away from the courthouse, I caught a glimpse of my parents in my rearview mirror, still standing in the same spot, looking lost and confused. For the first time in our relationship, I was the one driving away while they stood still, watching me leave. I had wanted them to see me, to recognize my capabilities, to acknowledge my worth. Mission accomplished. The question now was whether getting what I'd always wanted would feel anything like I'd imagined it would. The answer, as I would soon discover, was more complicated than I ever could have anticipated. I gave them a week to absorb what had happened before I made contact. A week for the reality to sink in, for the shock to wear off, and for them to begin understanding that their daughter, the one they'd spent decades dismissing, now held all the power in their relationship. During that week, I consulted with 3 different attorneys about landlord-tenant law, researched fair market rental rates for the area, and drafted a formal lease agreement that would protect both their rights as tenants and mine as their new landlord. I also spent considerable time examining my own motivations and deciding what kind of landlord I wanted to be. The truth was, I could have been vindictive. I could have demanded market rate rent they couldn't afford, forcing them to move. I could have implemented strict rules and rigid enforcement as payback for years of dismissive treatment. I could have made their lives miserable in a dozen legal ways, and part of me, the part that still carried 32 years of accumulated hurt, wanted to do exactly that. But that would have made me no better than they had been. It would have been using power to diminish rather than elevate, and I had no interest in becoming the kind of person who kicked others when they were down, even if those others had spent my entire life doing exactly that to me. So I crafted a lease agreement that was fair but firm, generous but clear about boundaries. The rent would be below market rate, but sufficient to cover my costs. They could remain in the house indefinitely as long as they met their obligations as tenants. But there would be new rules, new expectations, and a new dynamic that acknowledged the fundamental shift in our relationship. On the following Friday, exactly 1 week after the auction, I drove back to Maple Street with Janet and the lease documents. I had called ahead to arrange the meeting, speaking only to Mom, who had sounded nervous but grateful that I was willing to discuss arrangements rather than simply evicting them. The house looked different to me now that I owned it. I noticed things I'd overlooked before: the need for new gutters, the crack in the foundation that would require attention, the outdated electrical system that would need upgrading. These weren't just maintenance issues anymore. They were my responsibility, my investment, my property to care for or neglect. Mom answered the door with the same nervous energy she'd shown on the phone, her movements quick and uncertain. She led me to the living room where Dad sat in his recliner, looking older than he had just a week earlier. The stress of losing the house, combined with the shock of who had bought it, seemed to have aged him years in a matter of days. "Thank you for coming," Mom said, her voice carefully polite. "We weren't sure. We didn't know if you'd want to work something out or if you'd want us to leave," I finished for her. I considered that option. It would certainly be simpler from a business standpoint. Dad's head snapped up at that, his eyes sharp with alarm. Whatever pride had kept him from accepting my help before, the prospect of actual homelessness had apparently humbled considerably. "But," I continued, "I didn't buy this house to make you homeless. I bought it because you were going to lose it anyway, and this way it stays in the family, even if the ownership has changed." I opened my briefcase and pulled out 3 copies of the lease agreement I'd prepared. "I'm willing to rent the house to you under the terms outlined in this contract. I suggest you read it carefully and ask any questions you might have." The next hour was unlike any conversation we'd ever had as a family. For the first time in my life, my parents hung on my every word, asking careful questions about lease terms, maintenance responsibilities, and house rules. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 32 years had completely reversed, and we were all still learning how to navigate this new reality. The rental amount I proposed was significantly below market rate, $500 per month, for a house that could easily rent for $1,800. But it came with conditions that reflected my new position as both their landlord and their daughter, who had been dismissed for too long. The lease includes a respect clause, I explained, pointing to Section 4 of the contract. This house will be maintained as a place where all family members are treated with dignity and consideration. Dismissive comments, belittling behavior, or any form of emotional disrespect will be considered a violation of lease terms. Dad's face flushed red at that. Are you saying I can't speak my mind in my own house? This isn't your house anymore, Dad, I said quietly but firmly. It's my house and you're my tenant. And yes, I'm saying that if you want to continue living here, you need to treat me and everyone else with basic respect. The days of laughing at my offers or dismissing my capabilities are over. Mom placed a restraining hand on Dad's arm before he could respond. She had always been the peacekeeper, but now she was also the one who understood most clearly how precarious their situation was. What about Derek? She asked. He's still family. He'll still want to visit to stay here. Sometimes when he's between places. I had anticipated this question and spent considerable time thinking about my answer. Derek was part of the old dynamic, part of the system that had elevated him while diminishing me. But he was also my brother, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who used property ownership to exclude family members entirely. Derek is welcome to visit, I said. But this house will no longer serve as his backup plan when his schemes fail. He can't move back in indefinitely, can't use this as free housing while he pursues his next big idea, and he needs to treat this arrangement with the same respect I'm requiring from everyone else. Dad started to object, but I held up my hand. This isn't a negotiation. These are the terms under which I'm willing to rent to you. If you prefer, you're free to find other housing arrangements. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the corner, the same clock that had counted out so many tense family moments over the years. But this time, the tension felt different. This time, I wasn't the one hoping for approval or acceptance. This time, they needed something from me. We'll sign the lease, Mom said finally, speaking for both of them. We're grateful you're giving us this opportunity, Elsa. We know you didn't have to. As we went through the paperwork, initialing pages and signing documents, I felt something shifting inside me. This wasn't just about revenge or power or proving a point anymore. This was about establishing a new foundation for our relationship, one built on mutual respect rather than traditional hierarchy. There's one more thing, I said as we finished the legal formalities. I'll be updating this house over the next few years. New roof, updated electrical, kitchen renovation, landscaping improvements. You'll benefit from living in a nicer property, but I want it understood that these improvements are investments in my property, not gifts to my tenants. Dad nodded slowly, and for the first time since the auction, I saw something in his eyes that looked like respect. Not the grudging acknowledgement he might give to Derek's latest scheme, but actual respect for what I had accomplished and what I was capable of. As I drove away that evening, I realized that buying the house had given me something I'd been seeking my entire life: the power to define the terms of our relationship. Whether that would ultimately heal our family or destroy it remained to be seen, but for the first time, the choice was mine to make. Derek's reaction to the new living arrangements was everything I expected and worse. He showed up at the house 3 days after the lease signing, letting himself in with his old key as if nothing had changed, talking loudly about his latest business venture and how it was going to turn everything around for the family. I happened to be there that afternoon, meeting with a contractor about the roof repairs, when I heard his voice booming through the house. I found him in the kitchen, raiding the refrigerator while regaling Mom with stories about potential investors and revolutionary market opportunities. He looked up when I walked in, flashing the same charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. "Hey, little sister," he said, as if we were still children, and as if he hadn't completely failed to prevent his parents from losing their house. "Mom was just telling me about your new landlord arrangement. Pretty clever solution, I have to admit." The casual way he said it, as if my purchasing the house was just an interesting business maneuver rather than a desperate intervention to save our parents from homelessness, told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking this situation. "Derek," I said, my voice level, You're aware that you no longer live here, right? And that you should probably ask permission before letting yourself in? He laughed, the same dismissive sound Dad had made when I offered to help with the mortgage. Come on, Becca, don't be dramatic. This is still the family house. I'm still family. You're not going to start acting like some corporate landlord with your own brother, are you? Actually, I said, that's exactly what I'm going to do. This is my property now, and you're a guest who needs to be invited. Going forward, you need to call before coming over and wait to be let in like any other visitor. The smile faded from Derek's face, replaced by genuine confusion. In his mind, the house belonged to the family, and he was the most important member of that family. The concept that ownership had specific legal meanings, and that those meanings affected his access and privileges, seemed entirely foreign to him. You can't be serious, he said. I grew up here. This is my home too. No, I replied calmly. This was your home. Now it's my investment property that I'm renting to our parents under specific terms. Terms that don't include you having unlimited access, or treating this place like your personal crash pad. That's when his true character emerged. The charm disappeared completely, replaced by the entitled anger of someone who had never been told no before and didn't know how to process it. This is ridiculous, he snapped. You buy the house out from under your own parents and now you think you can control who visits them? You think owning some paperwork makes you better than the rest of us? I think preventing foreclosure makes me more helpful than someone who promised to handle everything and then disappeared when the auction date arrived, I said. Where were you that morning, Derek? Where were your big deals and your investor connections when it actually mattered? His face flushed red. I was working on solutions. Real solutions, not just throwing money at problems like some spoiled rich girl who thinks cash fixes everything. Cash does fix foreclosure, I pointed out. In fact, it's literally the only thing that fixes foreclosure. Your connections and potential deals were useless because they didn't exist in reality. What happened next revealed everything about who Derek really was underneath the charm and confidence. Instead of acknowledging his failure or expressing gratitude that someone had prevented our parents from becoming homeless, he turned vicious. You know what this is really about? He said, his voice rising. You're jealous. You've always been jealous that Dad believed in me instead of you, that he saw potential in me that he never saw in you. So now you're using your money to buy what you could never earn, his respect. The accusation hit close enough to home that I felt my composure waver for a moment. There was probably some truth in what he said, but it missed the larger point entirely. Derek, I said quietly, I offered to help save this house while leaving them in control of it. Dad laughed at that offer because it came from me instead of from you. So I found another way to solve the problem, and now they get to stay in their home instead of losing it to strangers. If that's jealousy, then I'm proud to be jealous. They shouldn't have to pay rent to live in their own house, he protested. You're right, I agreed. They shouldn't. But they do have to pay rent now because you couldn't deliver on your promises and Dad couldn't accept help from his daughter. This is the consequence of those choices. Mom had been standing in the doorway listening to this exchange, her face pale with distress. She stepped forward now, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Derek, honey, she said softly. Elsa saved us. We were going to lose everything, and she made sure we didn't. Maybe instead of being angry about how it happened, you could be grateful that it happened at all. Derek stared at her for a long moment, and I could see him processing the reality that even Mom, who had always made excuses for him, was not going to side with him this time. Fine, he said finally, but don't expect me to pretend this is normal or healthy. Don't expect me to play along with whatever power trip this is. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him, leaving Mom and me standing in the kitchen surrounded by the echoes of 32 years of dysfunctional family dynamics finally coming to a head. I'm sorry, Mom said after a long silence. He's upset and confused. He doesn't mean to be ungrateful. But I suspected he did mean it, and that was perhaps the most valuable thing Derek had ever given me. Absolute clarity about who he really was when his charm and privilege couldn't solve his problems. The renovation of 14 Maple Street began in earnest that summer, and with it, a transformation that went far deeper than new paint and updated fixtures. Every decision I made about the house was also a decision about what kind of relationship I wanted to have with my family. what kind of boundaries I needed to maintain, and what kind of future I was building for all of us. I started with the roof because it was both the most urgent repair and the most visible symbol of change. For weeks, contractors swarmed over the house, tearing off old shingles and replacing them with architectural-grade materials that would last for decades. Dad watched from the front porch, making occasional comments about how he would have handled things differently, but his criticism lacked its usual bite. He was learning slowly that his opinions were no longer driving decisions about his living space. The kitchen renovation was where I really made my mark. The old cabinets, which had been outdated when I was a child, gave way to custom maple units with soft close drawers and granite countertops. I installed a backsplash of subway tiles and upgraded all the appliances to energy-efficient stainless steel models. It was beautiful, modern, and expensive. Exactly the kind of improvement that increased property value while making daily life more pleasant for the occupants. Mom was delighted with the changes, expressing gratitude for the improved living space, with an enthusiasm that felt genuine. But I noticed something else in her response. A new awareness of my capabilities that had never existed before. She asked my opinion about color choices, deferred to my judgment about layout decisions, and treated me like someone whose expertise was valuable. It was a small thing, but after 32 years of being overlooked, it felt revolutionary. Dad's response was more complex. He clearly appreciated the improvements. I caught him running his hands over the new countertops with obvious pleasure. But he struggled with the reality that his daughter was the one providing them. His pride warred with his pragmatism, creating a tension that played out in dozens of small interactions. "You didn't have to spend this much," he said one afternoon as I supervised the installation of new hardwood floors in the living room. "The old carpet was fine." "The old carpet was 20 years old and starting to smell," I replied. "Besides, these improvements increase the property value. It's a good investment." The word investment seemed to bother him more than anything else. It was a reminder that this house was now my asset, my business decision, my property to improve or neglect as I saw fit. He was living in someone else's investment portfolio, and that someone else was the daughter he'd spent decades dismissing. But gradually, something began to shift in our interactions. Maybe it was the daily evidence of my competence and resources, or maybe it was the growing realization that I wasn't using my power to punish him, but Dad began treating me differently. He started asking my opinion about things, not just house-related decisions, but general questions about finances, business, and life choices. The first time he asked for my advice about refinancing his truck loan, I was so surprised I almost didn't respond. Here was the man who had laughed at my offer to help with sophisticated mortgage restructuring, now seeking my guidance on a simple auto loan. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was acknowledgement. "The interest rate they're offering seems high," he said, showing me the paperwork spread across the new granite countertop. "What do you think?" I reviewed the terms and realized he was being offered a terrible deal, probably because his credit had been damaged by the foreclosure and Derek's failed ventures. "This is predatory lending," I told him. "You can do much better. Let me make some calls." By the end of the week, I had helped him secure financing through my bank at half the interest rate the original lender had quoted. It was a small victory, but it represented something larger. The first time my father had voluntarily sought my help, and the first time I had been able to provide it without having my capabilities questioned. The house improvements continued through the fall. New bathrooms, updated electrical, fresh paint throughout, and landscaping that transformed the tired yard into something resembling suburban elegance. Each upgrade was a statement about my standards, my resources, and my commitment to maintaining this property properly. But the most important renovation wasn't visible in any of the construction work. It was the slow reconstruction of my relationship with my parents, particularly with Dad, as we learned to navigate our new dynamic. The turning point came in October, when Derek showed up unannounced again, this time with a woman he introduced as his business partner and a story about needing a place to stay while they launched their latest venture. He had apparently assumed that enough time had passed for things to return to normal, that my boundaries would soften with familiarity. "It would just be for a few weeks," he explained to Mom while I happened to be there discussing plans for the guest bathroom renovation. Just until we get our first round of funding secured. Derek, I said before Mom could respond, we've discussed this. You're welcome to visit, but you can't move back in. That's not how rental properties work. Come on, Elsa, he said, turning on the charm that had always worked before. It's not like you're going to evict your own family over a few weeks. Besides, I'll be contributing to the household expenses once the business takes off. No, I said simply. The answer is no, and it's going to remain no regardless of how you ask or how many times you ask. That's when Dad surprised everyone, including himself. Derek, he said quietly, your sister owns this house now. If she says no, then the answer is no. That's how this works. The moment hung in the air like a held breath. For the first time in our family's history, Dad had sided with me over Derek. Not because he agreed with my position necessarily, but because he recognized that I held the authority to make the decision. Derek stared at his father in shock, then at me with something approaching hatred before storming out with his business partner in tow. He didn't come back for 3 months, and when he finally did, it was with a much more respectful attitude and advance notice. That evening, as Dad and I stood in the renovated kitchen admiring the new pendant lights I'd installed over the breakfast bar, he said something that felt like the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get. You've done a good job with this place, he said, his voice gruff but sincere. Better than I ever did, if I'm being honest. It wasn't, I'm sorry for 32 years of treating you like you didn't matter. It wasn't, I was wrong to laugh at your offer to help. But it was acknowledgement and respect, and the beginning of something that felt like an adult relationship between equals. As I drove home that night to my own house, I realized that renovating 14 Maple Street had given me something I'd never expected. Not just my father's respect, but the satisfaction of knowing I had earned it on my own terms. 2 years after the auction, my relationship with my parents had settled into something I never could have imagined. Mutual respect built on clear boundaries and honest communication. It wasn't the relationship I had dreamed of as a child. That idealized version where my achievements were celebrated and my worth was never questioned. But it was something better. It was real. The changes were visible in dozens of small ways. Dad now asked my opinion on financial decisions before making them. Mom called to invite me to dinner rather than assuming I would always be too busy with my important career to spend time with family. When they introduced me to neighbors or friends, they talked about my work with genuine pride rather than dismissive tolerance. But the most significant change was in how we handled conflict. The old dynamic where disagreements turned into emotional manipulation and hurt feelings that festered for weeks had been replaced by direct communication and clear expectations. When Dad complained about the no smoking policy I'd instituted for the house, we had a straightforward conversation about property maintenance and lease terms. When Mom worried that my boundaries with Derek were too harsh, we discussed the difference between supporting family and enabling destructive behavior. Derek himself had gradually adapted to the new reality, though not without resistance. His visits became less frequent but more pleasant, marked by advance notice and genuine effort to be respectful. He had finally found some success with a small business doing handyman work. Nothing as grandiose as his previous schemes, but steady, enough to support himself without constant family bailouts. I suspected that being forced to stand on his own had been good for him, though he'd never admit it. The real transformation, though, was in my relationship with Dad. The man who had once laughed at my offer of financial help now regularly sought my advice on everything from insurance policies to investment strategies. It wasn't just that he recognized my expertise. It was that he had begun to see me as a person whose judgment he trusted and valued. The moment I knew things had fundamentally changed came on a Saturday morning in early spring. I was at the house, overseeing the installation of new gutters when Dad approached me with a manila folder full of paperwork. "Elsa," he said, his voice carrying a seriousness I'd rarely heard before. "I need to talk to you about something important." He led me to the kitchen table, the same table where we'd signed the lease agreement 2 years earlier, and spread out documents that I recognized as estate planning papers. "I've been working with a lawyer to update my will," he explained. "Given everything that's happened, given how things have changed, I wanted to make sure everything was fair and reflected." reflected reality. I looked at the papers he was showing me, a new will that split all assets equally between Derek and me, with specific provisions acknowledging my role in saving the family home and my ongoing contributions to the family's financial stability. It was a complete reversal of the previous will, which had left everything to Derek with the assumption that he would take care of his sister. "Dad," I said carefully, "you don't need to do this because you feel guilty or obligated. I bought the house as a business decision, and I've maintained it as an investment. I don't need you to balance some cosmic scale." He shook his head impatiently. "This isn't about guilt, Elsa. This is about fairness. This is about recognizing who you are and what you've done for this family. I should have seen it years ago. But I was—" He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man of his generation and background. "I was wrong about a lot of things. Wrong about Derek's potential. Wrong about your capabilities. Wrong about what makes someone valuable." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. For the first time in my life, my father talked to me about his own childhood, about growing up in a household where sons were expected to carry the family forward while daughters were expected to marry well and disappear into their husbands' families. He talked about his fears when Derek kept failing, about his confusion when I kept succeeding, about his struggle to reconcile his worldview with the reality of who his children actually were. I spent so many years waiting for Derek to become the man I thought he should be that I never saw the woman you had become, he said. By the time I realized my mistake, I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to admit I'd been wrong for so long. It wasn't a perfect apology. There were still gaps in his understanding, still traces of the old attitudes that had shaped our relationship for so long. But it was genuine, and it was enough. "The funny thing is," I told him, "I never needed you to admit you were wrong. I just needed you to see who I was." "I see you now," he said quietly. "I should have seen you all along." As we finished reviewing the estate documents, I realized that something had shifted in my own heart as well. The anger that had fueled my decision to buy the house, the hurt that had accumulated over 32 years of being overlooked, had gradually transformed into something else. Not forgiveness exactly. That implied that the past could be erased, or excused, but acceptance. Acceptance of who my parents were, of the limitations that had shaped their parenting, and of the fact that people could change even late in life. The house itself had become a symbol of this transformation. What had started as a business transaction motivated by hurt and frustration had evolved into something much more complex, a foundation for rebuilt relationships, a symbol of boundaries respected and capabilities acknowledged, and proof that sometimes the most important changes happen slowly, through daily interactions and gradual shifts in understanding. Mom joined us in the kitchen as we were finishing our conversation, bringing coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had been hoping for this discussion for years. "I'm proud of you both," she said, settling into her chair with a sigh of contentment. "Proud of Elsa for everything she's accomplished and everything she's done for this family, and proud of your father for finally having the courage to say what needed to be said." As I drove home that afternoon, I found myself thinking about the 12-year-old girl with the perfect report card, standing in the living room and waiting for her father to notice her achievements. That girl had spent 20 years building a life designed to prove her worth to people who seemed incapable of seeing it. But somewhere along the way, she had grown into a woman who knew her own value independent of anyone else's recognition. But the most important renovation wasn't visible in any of the construction work. It was the slow reconstruction of my relationship with my parents, particularly with Dad, as we learned to navigate our new dynamic. The turning point came in October, when Derek showed up unannounced again, this time with a woman he introduced as his business partner and a story about needing a place to stay while they launched their latest venture. He had apparently assumed that enough time had passed for things to return to normal, that my boundaries would soften with familiarity. It would just be for a few weeks, he explained to Mom while I happened to be there discussing plans for the guest bathroom renovation. Just until we get our first round of funding secured. "Derek," I said before Mom could respond, "we've discussed this. You're welcome to visit, but you can't move back in. That's not how rental properties work." "Come on, Elsa," he said, turning on the charm that had always worked before. It's not like you're going to evict your own family over a few weeks. Besides, I'll be contributing to the household expenses once the business takes off. No, I said simply. The answer is no, and it's going to remain no regardless of how you ask or how many times you ask. That's when Dad surprised everyone, including himself. Derek, he said quietly, your sister owns this house now. If she says no, then the answer is no. That's how this works. The moment hung in the air like a held breath. For the first time in our family's history, Dad had sided with me over Derek. Not because he agreed with my position necessarily, but because he recognized that I held the authority to make the decision. Derek stared at his father in shock, then at me with something approaching hatred before storming out with his business partner in tow. He didn't come back for 3 months, and when he finally did, it was with a much more respectful attitude and advance notice. That evening, as Dad and I stood in the renovated kitchen admiring the new pendant lights I'd installed over the breakfast bar, he said something that felt like the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get. "You've done a good job with this place," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Better than I ever did, if I'm being honest. It wasn't, 'I'm sorry for 32 years of treating you like you didn't matter.' It wasn't, 'I was wrong to laugh at your offer to help.' But it was acknowledgement and respect, and the beginning of something that felt like an adult relationship between equals." As I drove home that night to my own house, I realized that renovating 14 Maple Street had given me something I'd never expected. Not just my father's respect, but the satisfaction of knowing I had earned it on my own terms. 2 years after the auction, my relationship with my parents had settled into something I never could have imagined. Mutual respect built on clear boundaries and honest communication. It wasn't the relationship I had dreamed of as a child. That idealized version where my achievements were celebrated and my worth was never questioned. But it was something better. It was real. The changes were visible in dozens of small ways. Dad now asked my opinion on financial decisions before making them. Mom called to invite me to dinner rather than assuming I would always be too busy with my important career to spend time with family. When they introduced me to neighbors or friends, they talked about my work with genuine pride rather than dismissive tolerance. But the most significant change was in how we handled conflict. The old dynamic where disagreements turned into emotional manipulation and hurt feelings that festered for weeks had been replaced by direct communication and clear expectations. When Dad complained about the no-smoking policy I'd instituted for the house, we had a straightforward conversation about property maintenance and lease terms. When Mom worried that my boundaries with Derek were too harsh, we discussed the difference between supporting family and enabling destructive behavior. Derek himself had gradually adapted to the new reality, though not without resistance. His visits became less frequent but more pleasant, marked by advance notice and genuine effort to be respectful. He had finally found some success with a small business doing handyman work. Nothing as grandiose as his previous schemes, but steady, enough to support himself without constant family bailouts. I suspected that being forced to stand on his own had been good for him, though he'd never admit it. The real transformation, though, was in my relationship with Dad. The man who had once laughed at my offer of financial help now regularly sought my advice on everything from insurance policies to investment strategies. It wasn't just that he recognized my expertise. It was that he had begun to see me as a person whose judgment he trusted and valued. The moment I knew things had fundamentally changed came on a Saturday morning in early spring. I was at the house, overseeing the installation of new gutters when Dad approached me with a manila folder full of paperwork. "Elsa," he said, his voice carrying a seriousness I'd rarely heard before. "I need to talk to you about something important." He led me to the kitchen table, the same table where we'd signed the lease agreement 2 years earlier, and spread out documents that I recognized as estate planning papers. "I've been working with a lawyer to update my will," he explained. "Given everything that's happened, given how things have changed, I wanted to make sure everything was fair and reflected reality." I looked at the papers he was showing me, a new will that split all assets equally between Derek and me, with specific provisions acknowledging my role in saving the family home and my ongoing contributions to the family's financial stability. It was a complete reversal of the previous will, which had left everything to Derek with the assumption that he would take care of his sister. "Dad," I said carefully, "you don't need to do this because you feel guilty or obligated. I bought the house as a business decision, and I've maintained it as an investment. I don't need you to balance some cosmic scale." He shook his head impatiently. "This isn't about guilt, Elsa. This is about fairness. This is about recognizing who you are and what you've done for this family. I should have seen it years ago. But I was—" He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man of his generation and background. "I was wrong about a lot of things. Wrong about Derek's potential. Wrong about your capabilities. Wrong about what makes someone valuable." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. For the first time in my life, my father talked to me about his own childhood, about growing up in a household where sons were expected to carry the family forward while daughters were expected to marry well and disappear into their husbands' families. He talked about his fears when Derek kept failing, about his confusion when I kept succeeding, about his struggle to reconcile his worldview with the reality of who his children actually were. "I spent so many years waiting for Derek to become the man I thought he should be that I never saw the woman you had become," he said. "By the time I realized my mistake, I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to admit I'd been wrong for so long." It wasn't a perfect apology. There were still gaps in his understanding, still traces of the old attitudes that had shaped our relationship for so long. But it was genuine, and it was enough. "The funny thing is," I told him, "I never needed you to admit you were wrong. I just needed you to see who I was." "I see you now," he said quietly. "I should have seen you all along." As we finished reviewing the estate documents, I realized that something had shifted in my own heart as well. The anger that had fueled my decision to buy the house, the hurt that had accumulated over 32 years of being overlooked, had gradually transformed into something else. Not forgiveness exactly. That implied that the past could be erased or excused, but acceptance. Acceptance of who my parents were, of the limitations that had shaped their parenting, and of the fact that people could change even late in life. The house itself had become a symbol of this transformation. What had started as a business transaction motivated by hurt and frustration had evolved into something much more complex, a foundation for rebuilt relationships, a symbol of boundaries respected and capabilities acknowledged, and proof that sometimes the most important changes happen slowly, through daily interactions and gradual shifts in understanding. Mom joined us in the kitchen as we were finishing our conversation, bringing coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had been hoping for this discussion for years. "I'm proud of you both," she said, settling into her chair with a sigh of contentment. "Proud of Elsa for everything she's accomplished and everything she's done for this family, and proud of your father for finally having the courage to say what needed to be said." As I drove home that afternoon, I found myself thinking about the 12-year-old girl with the perfect report card, standing in the living room and waiting for her father to notice her achievements. That girl had spent 20 years building a life designed to prove her worth to people who seemed incapable of seeing it. But somewhere along the way, she had grown into a woman who knew her own value independent of anyone else's recognition. The fact that recognition had finally come felt like a gift rather than a victory. It wasn't the validation I had once desperately craved, because I no longer needed external validation to know who I was. Instead, it was the foundation for a relationship I had never thought possible, one between equals, built on mutual respect and honest communication. I had set out to prove that I was worthy of my father's love and respect. What I had discovered instead was something far more valuable: the knowledge that I had always been worthy, regardless of whether anyone else could see it. And now, finally, I had a family that could see it too. Has life ever led you to create a family outside of blood ties? I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter. And if this journey touched something inside you, feel free to support the channel or pass this video along to someone who needs it.